So, good evening, good afternoon, everyone, whichever is the appropriate greeting from wherever you are. Today we're very excited to be joined by Mr. David Lega in the second instalment of our MEP discussion series. David, how are you?
I'm good, and you?
Yeah, very well, thanks.
We're all staying
Um,
healthy.
exactly,
So,
exactly. Staying home and staying healthy. So let me just do a quick round of introductions,
uh-huh.
perhaps, and then we can get into the discussion. So Mr. Lega is a Swedish MEP from the Christian Democrat Party, which fits into the EPP group in the European Parliament. He's a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, a member of the Subcommittee on Human Rights, and he's in the delegation for EU-Russian cooperation, and is also a board member of the Working Group on Antisemitism. We also have Dana Winter, our EUJS board member from Austria, who's currently studying for a postgraduate degree at the London School of Economics. And lastly, myself, my name's Ilan Selby, and I'm the policy officer at EUJS. And for those of you tuning into an EUJS discussion for the first time, the European Union of Jewish Students is the umbrella organisation of 36 Jewish student unions from across Europe, and is the democratic and peer-led representation of roughly 160,000 European Jews. And basically how we plan this discussion to be structured is we'll begin by getting to know you a bit better, Mr. Lega, about your political story and background, before jumping straight into the discussion on your role in Parliament, your work in combating anti-Semitism, and as well, and most importantly, we'll give space for the audience to get involved by sending in questions so that we can put them to you in a sort of Q&A. And yes, I'll now hand you over to Dana.
Hello, thanks to everyone for joining, and thank you, Mr. Lega, for being here. I'm gonna start off by asking you just a few questions on your path, how you got to where you are today, basically. And I think my first question is how you got into politics in general, because some of you may know, but Mr. Lega had a very different career first. So if you maybe could walk us through how you got here.
Yes, of course, and thank you so much for having me. I'm really happy to take part in this seminar as well. Well, my background is pretty unusual, since I was born with a severe disability from birth, which makes my arms completely paralyzed, and I have about 30% strength and movement in my legs. I was born in 1973, where my father was a refugee from Poland. They escaped Poland in 1968 due to the increasing anti-Semitism and got back there at that time. Met my mother, and they got me very young. My father was just over 20 and my mother was 16 when they had me. So my first years was a lot of training to be able to sit up, to move, to actually learn how to write with my mouth and use my feet. And then I got into sports. So I became a Paralympian in swimming and did 2 World Championships, 2 Paralympic Games, with a record of 14 world records and 3 World Championship gold medals. And I retired after Sydney 2000 and was supposed to focus on my law career, since I studied law at the same time. But instead I went into businesses and trying to do lectureships, trying to motivate young people, trying to talk to companies about leadership, and did that for 10 years. And in 2010, I joined the Christian Democratic Party in Sweden, which is a value-based party, not a religious party. It's different in different countries, but here it's based on values. So it's the most usual party to join if you have a Christian or Jewish background, actually, which I joined and became the deputy mayor for Gothenburg, my hometown, for 9 years. And then I got elected into the European Parliament last year. So that's a quick resume.
Thank you very much for that. So I guess my next question would be who your political role model is, and if that person might have influenced you getting into politics, or if that came up later.
Well, I think that this with role models, it's a bit based on my previous career as a public speaker as well, and talking about leadership, that it's a bit dangerous to only have one role model. So I always have about 50 because I don't think that anyone is perfect. So you try to combine the parts of people that you admire and try to do the best you can. So in sports, I had a lot of different role models, and naturally I have it in politics as well. On a local level in Gothenburg, I have a lot of role models that people don't know about, but I think that in an international perspective, I am really impressed by Barack Obama as well, both as his leadership, but also his speeches, how he reached out and how he touched people when he was talking. So there's a lot of different role models. And also my old swim coach could be a good role model for politics because it is based on values. And if it isn't based on values, it should have been.
Thank you very much. And then my another question, what is your proudest political achievement to date, whether that is in the Swedish environment or European?
Honestly, I think my proudest political moment is yet to come. No, but I think that it's always, you need to always try to reach further and do more. And if I look in a retrospective perspective, what have I done? I think that the things that I'm the most proud of are things that aren't only my success. It's things that we have done together as a team with the party or with the city of Gothenburg when we have negotiated something off camera and try to just make a real difference, which we can never sort of talk about afterwards to claim a victory. But you can always find these victories as well, which you have for your own sake. And things where you actually affect most people, regardless if it's the Jewish community, the disabled community, or elderly, since I was in charge of that. Those things will make me most proud when I look back as well. But it's really hard to pinpoint one because they are still ahead of me.
Thank you very much. I'm now going to hand back over to Ilan for the next part of our discussion.
Great, thanks, Dana. Thank you very much for those answers, Mr. Lega, very interesting. So let's jump into the parliamentary discussion then.
Yes.
Yesterday, the Hungarian parliament passed a law which granted Viktor Orban, Prime Minister of Hungary, special powers, which essentially turned Hungary into a dictatorship, allowing him to rule by decree for an indefinite period of time. Now, Fidesz, the Hungarian party, which Orban is head of, is also in the European People's Party, the political group which the Swedish, the Christian Democrat Party in Sweden, your party, are in. I'm just wondering if you have, what do you make of the situation, and do you think the EPP has been brought into disrepute, and what do you see as the necessary steps for the EPP and the EU, if any, to be taken going forward?
Well, it's tragic what they are doing. I criticized it a lot, both on Twitter and when I met my colleagues, but also before the election, when I was starting to become a candidate, we also, with my party, the Christian Democratic Party, we said that it's time to exclude them out of the EPP group, and we fought for that. And we got halfway already then with that they are frozen, that they are not allowed to vote, they weren't allowed to take place in Zagreb. Their voice doesn't count while the party is evaluating on how to proceed. I wish that we could reach further at once to exclude them of the EPP, because they have changed since they joined the EPP, and over the last decade, definitely. I don't see their values being part of the EPP values anymore. So I think that it would be better to exclude them now.
Mm-hmm. And if I could ask as well, what particular blockages are there which stops, as you mentioned, your desire is for an expulsion of Fidesz from the EPP group. What do you see as the blocks towards that happening?
I think that maybe in the next meetings we're going to have with the parties as well, that is going to come up on the table again to see, because different countries have different opinions, different values, but in the Swedish EPP delegation, we have two parties, the moderates and the Christian Democrats, and both of us are crystal clear that we feel that it's time to exclude them out of the EPP group.
Okay. And as well at EUJS, we're currently hoping to disseminate an open letter for MEPs in the EPP group to perhaps push towards this expulsion of Fidesz, as we do find it very worrying, particularly from a minority perspective as well. And at times when authoritarian governments look to take control and power grab, it's often minority communities that get badly affected by it. And
unfortunately, it's not uncommon for authoritarian leaders to take advantage of global crisis to increase their power. But to use this pandemic as an excuse to seize power, it is unacceptable.
Absolutely. And on that note, can I ask if you think, do you see any other areas or any other states or situations where the pandemic can be exploited and manipulated to this extent?
Well, we don't know how Russia is going to act yet with their election 10th of May. But we know that Vladimir Putin is trying to further strengthen his grasp over the whole country of Russia by excluding by creating new laws which makes them stay with power until 2036 as well. So it's not uncommon there. We see China's economic expansion at the same time now, where they are trying to invest in companies who suffers in the pandemic as well, or during the pandemic. We've seen it all over Europe, but also all over the world, not least Africa, how they increase their economic grasp over countries. And naturally, it's worrisome that all these countries continue to do the same in the wake of a crisis.
Absolutely. Can I ask, focusing on your committee work in the subcommittee of human rights that you're a member of, can you talk me through what the agenda is at the moment, which issues are spoken about most, and generally what's your involvement in this committee?
Well, at the moment we have no meetings due to the lockdown. So for a few weeks we have been home. We're not sure when the next meeting with the DROA committee will be. It might be in a few weeks. They are trying to set up a system which makes us being able to have more meetings over link, because it's also a matter of democracy that if you do it, we need to make sure that everyone can connect and take part. So that is unfortunately a bit on a hold. I'm also co-chairing the Children Rights Intergroup of the European Parliament, which means that my focus will stay a lot on children's rights, both in the DROA committee, but also in the Intergroup. It's a cross-parliamentary platform where we try to, without digging in ourselves in trenches, try to create situations that are better for children. And the things I have been talking a lot about there is not at least children's rights online, where we see the sexual exploitation and different issues as well. Sure.
And I guess obviously it is difficult to speak about it with the current suspension of Parliament. What sort of broader issues would you expect to be spoken about when hopefully the committee reconvenes in the not too distant future?
Well, I hope that we will continue in plenary to discuss and have urgency resolutions towards China, not at least concerning the situation for Uyghurs with the re-education camps, which is just another form of concentration camps. And we unfortunately know all too well how that affects our people. I had an emergency resolution accepted by the plenary for Strasbourg, but they had the lockdown before regarding situation for Swedish journalist Uyghur, who's been locked in for several years in Chinese prison, just now with a trial where they denied Swedish help since he had resigned his citizenship, they said.
Right. And on this topic, actually, I'm not sure if you're aware, but at EUJS we're currently running a campaign entitled Freedom for Uyghurs, never again right now. And essentially how this came about was, as European Jews, we started to ask ourselves, what does, every year during Holocaust Remembrance, we ask ourselves, we say never again, and what does this mean to us today? And what we said was, we have a responsibility and an obligation to stand up to state-sponsored persecution of any people, wherever and whenever it occurs. So I'm very pleased that you mentioned this is on the agenda, as this is something at EUJS that we care passionately about. Perhaps going into this topic a bit more, if you touched upon it there, if you could walk us through what has been done on the issue, what is being done, and what you think should and will be achieved at an EU level against China and on the persecution of Uyghur Muslims.
Well, the resolutions are one thing that we actually need to continue and condemn how China is acting towards minorities, journalists, press freedom, human rights in general. And we usually have these in our free trade agreements and trade agreements with different countries. We have clauses on how to respect human rights. What we need to be better at from the European Parliament's perspective is to actually make sure and follow up that these clauses are being respected and followed. That is another kind of work which I believe haven't been done as proper as it should have been. So we need to, together in the European Union, we are one of the world's largest economies. That makes a difference. But also regarding China, I believe that the urgency resolutions are at least and maybe even a stronger weapon, because we can't affect China only economically because they are too powerful economically, but we can affect them publicly and when we are criticizing them. That affects them more than many people think. So what we need to do is continue to do that as well. We had the Ilham Tohti as the Sakharov Prize winner just before around Christmas as well, and that is one way to actually make sure that we show China that we don't accept it. We had a resolution in December, the China cables, so we're trying to do a lot at the same time.
Absolutely. And do you think that there's, a lot of as you mentioned too, it's very difficult to hurt China economically given their economic status. And through this public, not attack, but through trying to target China publicly in their image, do you think divestment from companies is a way which this should go forward? There was an Australian think tank published this quite comprehensive report on 83 organisations operating in and around Xinjiang province, where these so-called re-education camps and centres are placed. What do you make about economic divestment on the actual organisations operating in this province?
I think I need to look at it a bit more to be able to give an honest answer, depending on how much we want to control our companies as well. What can we do out of their perspective? What we can do is to make it unprofitable to work there. That is one way. But also the Uyghurs are affected by other parts of China and other policies as well. Look at Hong Kong. Unfortunately, due to the pandemic, the whole demonstration, the whole action towards one state, two systems, which they actually totally failed. Unfortunately, the whole demonstration collapsed with the pandemic. So we need to make sure that they are being supported even after it's possible to go out in Hong Kong again. We also need to continue to support Taiwan. And just the action from other organizations like the World Health Organization, when they don't dare to raise Taiwan as a positive example due to worries from China, it's completely unacceptable as well. So we need to continue on many different levels at the same time. not to accept China's movements.
Thank you for that. I'll pass you over to Dana now, and perhaps I'll just remind everyone to send in their questions on the chat in Zoom. That would be great. Dana.
Thank you. So I'm now going to move over a little bit to your work on combating anti-Semitism. So as Ilan mentioned in the introduction, you are a board member of the Working Group on Anti-Semitism of the European Parliament. And maybe to start off, could you quickly explain what that body is and what your role exactly means?
Yes. Well, I think if I can start from this perspective, I think that the Parliament has increased its efforts for this session as well, trying to combat anti-Semitism, but it's really, really hard to find a good way to do it because, as we know, anti-Semitism is often hidden. And its main responsibility are the different countries to combat it. So what we need to do from a European perspective is to find ways to support the different countries in their work. One example of a country who has failed miserably, unfortunately, is my own country, Sweden, where we have the city of Malmö, for example, which is one of the most dangerous cities to live an active life as a Jew. People are worried to wear the yarmulke or wear a necklace in Malmö, which is also completely unacceptable. And this hasn't started now. This has been a movement for over 15, 20 years. We know for a fact, after what the previous working group have done and their research, that where they actually try to look at reasons for anti-Semitism, and they found out that 86% of Swedes confuse their views on Jews with their views on the country of Israel. And since it has been a socialist country for many, many years before Sweden, with close ties to PLO and the Palestinian movement, that has affected views on Jews everywhere in Sweden as well, in a completely unacceptable way as well. So what we need to do from the European perspective is to set up good models. The IRA definition, for example, what is anti-Semitism, how the examples, how can we fight it together? In some countries, unfortunately, we have to start from the beginning to see what is anti-Semitism, how does it look today compared to 10 years ago, 20 years ago. So I think that the European Parliament can be better in finding a common base there, which is a lot of what the working group is doing. But also now we know, we can also push the Commission to do more. And since the Commission have their Katarina von Schnobein, who works as a coordinator for the work against anti-Semitism, and now she has even got a vice chair of the Commission, I forgot his name, I'm so sorry, who will be designated working with this on a European level as well. That shows that Europe is taking this seriously, and that gives a lot of pressures on the countries who have failed to do a good work before.
Okay, thank you for that. And then you've already touched upon it a little bit, but my next question is what the situation of anti-Semitism is like in Sweden. Maybe you can talk a little bit about the rest of Sweden and compare it to Malmö, and then were you already involved in combating anti-Semitism in Sweden when you, before getting involved in the working group?
Yes, I think that Malmö is the worst if you look at it with a perspective of anti-Semitism. We have three pretty large congregations in Sweden, Stockholm, Gothenburg, and Malmö. And there's nothing in Stockholm and Gothenburg that compares to the situation in Malmö, where people are afraid and worried in a whole different perspective. But the government has failed to provide security in an acceptable way as well, regarding the congregation, but also the Jewish school, the Jewish home for the elderlies in different countries, where they usually can provide money for security like fences and metal detectors, but they have not been able to provide money to support with the security, the staff, the guards who will be there, which is the only cost that actually matters when you're trying to get children and elderly to feel safe as well. So I think that the Swedish authorities are still trying to wake up and see that this is a real and dangerous situation. We had an incident in my home city, Gothenburg, last year with Molotov cocktails being thrown towards the synagogue. And that was sent from young refugees who did this because they were angry and upset with Israel. And people are worried, but also they are proud. In Gothenburg and Stockholm, we are doing a lot of activities outdoors. We have the Hanukkah candles being lit in the center of Gothenburg outdoors, with a lot of festivities to get other people to take part. And there was a lot of people there for this as well. So we are trying to not be a closed community, but trying to be an open community, which makes it less strange for people who are on the outside.
And why do you think that there is such a big difference for Jewish people living in Malmö and in the rest of Sweden?
I think a lot because of the local leadership for the last 15 years in Malmö as well, who hasn't stood up when activities happened, when actions happened, when people were worried. Instead of protecting the Jewish community, they kept criticizing the country of Israel on a whole different level. And which meant that, I mean, you probably know that even Madeleine Albright criticized the city of Malmö and their actions. And the local leader, the mayor of Malmö, was with the same party, the Social Democratic Party, who governed Sweden for the majority of the last decade, the last century, actually. And since they didn't criticize him publicly, he was free to continue roaming. So that's one of the main reasons that the politicians didn't do what it takes.
And do you have any advice for us as young European Jews and students and young professionals, what we can do to fight anti-Semitism more across Europe?
Continue to be proud, continue to be out, continue to take part in Jewish life, but also in the other parts of life, because we need to be visible everywhere to get people to understand. Because usually we know that people are worried, afraid of what they don't know. That seems strange, but I think that to continue to be out and talk about it, to never accept one anti-Semitic comment, to always stand up, is what makes a difference. Because when we start ignoring the little things in the beginning, that will make the step to the large horrific acts smaller. And that is the largest worry.
Thank you very much for that. We're now going to go over to a few questions we got from the audience. Let me just find it quickly. The first question I have is from a student from the UK, and they asked, Hungary's parliament yesterday voted to give all power to the Prime Minister and allow him to rule by decree for an unlimited amount of time. Is there a space for dictatorship inside the EU?
I couldn't hear you at the beginning. I'm so sorry. It sort of broke up.
Don't worry. The question was about Hungary's Prime Minister to now be able to rule by decree. And the question is if you think there is space for a dictatorship inside the EU.
No, I think this doesn't at all comply with the European fundamental values and the criteria we have for what a democracy should be. That's why we're criticizing it so much as we actually are, both within the EPP group, but naturally also we need to look at, is this acceptable at all in a European Union perspective, not at least concerning the Copenhagen criteria. But I mean, many countries are doing state of emergency actions, which is what Hungary actually hides under when they're doing this. The part that worries me is the indefinite time that they actually do this. That worries me a lot, and also their track record isn't that impressive, is it?
Thank you. And then we have another question from a student from South Africa who asked, how did you make the transition from a Paralympic sportsman to politics? It's very different.
Well, in Sweden, we had elections every 4 years, and Paralympics and Olympics are held every 4 years, so it was quite easy. No, I'm kidding. But I think that in my youth and everything in my life was focused on becoming stronger so I could actually have a chance to live as a normal life as possible later. And I had a lot of support from society, from my family, from my teachers, from my physiotherapists, from my swim coaches, and a lot of people always supported me in getting stronger and better. And in the 90s, when I was a top swimmer, an elite swimmer, I had a wholly different support system as a top athlete. So after that, I felt it was time to give back to society, because I knew what helped me. And a lot of people who go into politics also do it out of a negative reason, try to make sure that what happened to me won't happen to anyone else. For me, it was purely positive. I knew what helped me, and I wanted to contribute to give other children, regardless if they were disabled or not, Jewish or not, a chance, my immigrants or not, a chance to achieve the most out of their own lives with their own abilities instead. So the transition was natural. These are my years to give back.
Thank you very much. We also have another question, which, you know, as well, you touched upon this earlier, Mr. Lega. You were saying how, as young European Jews, we need to be proud of our identity. And we find that, you know, being a young European is not too dissimilar from being a young European Jew in a lot of respects. Jewish rights are human rights, and human rights are Jewish rights in the very same sense. And in this regard, the question from a German student is asking, you know, we've seen events of far-right extremism and anti-Semitism, recent events, but at the same time we also see far-left anti-Semitism manifesting, coming from the UK. You can see it in the recent Labour anti-Semitism crisis. What do you make of this nuance? How do you perceive the threat of far-right anti-Semitism and far-left anti-Semitism? Is there a different way that we should combat each hate?
And don't forget the religious extremism as well. I mean, we have the three. The only thing that unites these three groups are the hatred for us, which is absolutely horrible, naturally, as well. But I think that what we have failed, if I can start there, what we have failed to do as a European Union is to explain the need of it, because this is 70 years after the Holocaust, a generation after. I worry that a lot of these groups are just waiting for their last survivors not to be with us anymore. And we need to carry the torch to explain why we need to talk to each other, why we need to understand each other, why we need to trade, why we need to understand the cultural differences, why we need to respect the human rights, because we know all too well why that happened almost close to 100 years ago. why it started, and we want to make sure that it doesn't happen again. But unfortunately, other countries don't have that. Other parts of other countries don't have that in their memory banks, in their families. So we need to remind them in a positive way why this is important. Well, I was in Israel just before November, on a study trip to look at different parts of the Israeli society regarding and the relationships with the European Union. And it was really interesting to have the discussion regarding the politics in Israel, that people voting in Israel go towards the center instead of going to the far left and right when they are voting, which is completely unlike close to all European countries, where larger and larger groups, unfortunately, are going to the far left and far right in democracies as well, where Israeli elections are more pragmatic. Unfortunately, they still can't form a government, but the voters want them to be more pragmatic. And I talked to a professor there who said that in Israel, they always have the remembrance of tragedy close to their hearts, which we don't have anymore in Europe because we have forgotten it. And it is also important that we keep talking and remembering the tragedy that affected Europe before the European Union, and how that became an end to the war-torn continent as well. Because since the European Union and community in the beginning started, we haven't had any war between two member countries, which is an important part as well. So we need to continue reminding people why this is important. And we failed that together with Britain regarding the Brexit talks in total, where it only became a matter on how much money goes as a cost. We fought it talking about what we gained economically, but not in other perspectives as well. And I think that is closely combined to the anti-Semitic discussions as well.
Yeah. And perhaps if I can ask one last question to
of course.
Finish on, well, it's up to you whether this be a positive note or not. What do you see the future of the EU in, say, 10, 15 years or so? What do you see as the main trends, and how do you see this panning out, I guess?
Well, I hope that the European Union focuses a bit more on its core objectives and core missions. I think that another reason to Brexit is that Britain and many other countries don't want one European state, one federal state. So I think that the European Union need to continue to focus on trade, environment, the values, the European values, human rights, and keep focusing on that instead of trying to do everything and becoming the European United States, because I think that is dangerous. I think more countries would have the discussion of leaving. But if we go back to our core, I hope that Britain will join again. Maybe Scotland. We don't know what's happening to you guys. So I take it in a positive note. But yeah. I worry if we are moving towards something that most citizens don't want. I don't want an empire. I want a union.
Sure. So thank you so much for that discussion. Thanks for your time. And
thank you so much for having this.
No, not at all. And
could I tell people are free to send more questions after as well if they have any, through my Twitter or my Instagram or my Facebook. So maybe we can provide the links on your webpage later for that if they have any more questions.
Absolutely. We'll put a video of this conversation up and put your contact information, your social media information below as well, so people can get in contact. Great, thank you very much. And
thank you for everything you do.
Thank you. I'd also encourage everyone to stay in the loop for our web session discussion series. We have an event tomorrow evening at 8 p.m. So check out our Facebook and Twitter and Instagram about that as well. And yeah, have a great evening and stay safe, stay at home.
You too. Take care.
As well. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.